I think doing the art on 84 has, in a way, it was a turning point in our art. I think up to that point, there were political elements to our work in that, for example, a lot of the earlier images were dealing with issues of identity, cultural prejudice, based on our experiences, British Asians. But I think dealing with the 84 topic in itself really changed the direction of our work in being more overtly political.
And more outward-looking as well.
Yeah, and more
moving away
outward-looking
from our personal, our immediate environment.
That's right.
My art has helped me come to terms with what happened, whether it's 984, whether it's hundreds of years before that. It's helped me understand the world that I'm living in. It's helped me understand my life in terms of my personal, whether it's my family life, whether it's my community life, whether it's my world life. It's helped me every single way. Art has made me go through these certain almost rituals. I've got this idea that first you identify what the problem was. First you learn, you can call it that. Once you've learnt something, whether it's about 984, might be an incident that happened, a massacre that happened, you learn about it, read around the topic, try and build some critical analysis if you can, then you reflect. That doesn't necessarily mean you reflect with a pen. It could be you just sit quietly, sit and focus, try and come up with, does that make sense? You marinate, you might discuss it with other people, but you reflect. And lastly, after the reflection, you've got something in you, you've got something to offer the world, you create. That's the third. If you create, if you write it down, you share it, even better.
That event, we're facing the consequences for that. The parents who survived had to hide from the government and are in threat of the government, so they'll be more submissive in ways. So we're now dealing with that because then our family isn't as proud, as open, as wantful, or even their own dignity, they don't value it as much anymore. They don't feel they should have their own homeland because these are the people that survived. So that's what I'm dealing with from 1984. That's why I'm trying to deal with that.
I felt like there was no voice coming from the Sikh perspective, and when I say the Sikh perspective, I mean the revolutionary Sikh perspective. I felt like we've been taking the propaganda and taking the colonial narrative and just going with that without actually looking at how Sikhs in the past had dealt with things and how we should be dealing with things as Sikhs for the future.
Yeah.
So I felt like to kind of reignite those kind of thoughts and passions, I should start getting the art out there.
There is an element of anger, there is an element of, sadness, and there is an element of, pain and like loss, but those are kind of like surface emotions, When I go deeper into those things, I feel like pride, like an overwhelming sense that like what happened in 84, what happened throughout our history is kind of a repetition of our stance against injustice. And
984 comes out all over the place, and from the documentary that I did on the Sikh Renaissance, I interviewed 20 participants all from North America, and I sat and I asked them these questions. What was your biggest turning point? What made you do this? And it's incredible how so many artists were all saying 984. Some artists might say 9/11, but it was overwhelming how many, even if the art wasn't ever talking about 984, a lot of them were saying, yeah, it was a turning point.
Dealing with the 1984 theme initially, I think it was just our way of trying to do something, just anything, just to try and set the record straight. I mean, we felt pretty helpless. We were just at school at that time. We didn't really feel we had a voice or the power to really change things significantly. And I guess we just did the only thing that we knew how, which was to try to paint our emotions and our feelings into this piece of work, and something that we hoped, at some point would be exhibited and generate debate about, well, what does this painting represent, and what side of the story is it telling, other than the propaganda line that was told by many of the media channels at that time.
But I think our emotion is reflected in the composition itself as well, because
in the later work,
in both works really, in the earliest 1984 painting, but also more obviously in the later version, because there is that dimension where on the one hand you have this bird's eye, very distant view of the Golden Temple, and that was really a reflection of our geographic distance from the events that were happening, and also our feeling of being helpless to kind of do anything about it because we were looking on from so far away. But as you get further down the image itself, it suddenly moves into this very claustrophobic view of pilgrims trying to flee,
very close at street level.
out of the Golden Temple, and that really was reflecting our emotional attachment, even though we were, thousands of miles away. Emotionally, we were very close to what was happening within India, and that's how we symbolically represented those feelings within the painting.
At the end of the day, I don't think there's any kind of bad emotion or good emotion, as long as you don't dwell on that emotion and just stay stagnant, and as long as you're kind of learning from what you're kind of going through, and trying to move forward, then no, I don't think there's anything wrong with anger.
A long time ago I was angry with the situation, but when you look at it, what am I angry with? I'm not angry, Sikh aren't angry. We're trying to deal with the situation to make the world better. We're trying to understand the situation to destroy it. So what is the problem we're dealing with? I try and articulate that through the music and go against the propaganda that's prevalent.
If you kind of stop at anger as an emotion, it can be limiting because, I don't know, it's like you've kind of bounded yourself, right, in this emotion and you let that emotion shape everything you're doing. If you use that emotion as a catalyst to really explore your feelings, then I think it can ultimately lead to a positive feeling, because behind that anger there has to be an emotion that triggered the anger. Does anger exist by itself? Like, are you just angry because you're angry, or does something trigger that anger, and then what triggered that anger, and then what really is your engagement with that reality that triggers this sense of anger?
1984 happens, suddenly they're doing art, and you can't even comprehend it. The academic in me is telling me, it makes sense, because if you think about it, our Sikh culture was being destroyed. Once the Sikh culture is being destroyed, some people need to come and fill in that gap, whether it happens naturally or not. Once you realise the Sikh reference library was burnt and looted, part of you is like, what? That is a direct attack on our culture, our art. We need to fill that gap. So when there's a statement from Beyond Singh in 1982, he says it to Mark Tully in an interview, BBC correspondent, and he says to him, the work we're doing is to destroy that culture. 2 years before 1984. This is something that was happening way before. It was, in his words, we are now creating a composite culture. The time of Sikh culture is over now. Sikh culture is just having art, Sikhs express themselves. Like, if we can't do that, we're starting to understand that this was an attack on us in every single sphere. And unless we deal with every single sphere, whether it's the legal, the social, the art, the cultural, we're not going to get anywhere. So part of that process for me, and I find a lot of Sikh artists around the world, is to realize, something was lost, now we're going to make it back.